coming. Welcome. And we meet here in this beautiful spot once again after coming here just a short 13 months ago. My mother would be so happy to see you all here. My mother was an extraordinary person of many talents, of extremely high energy, and she had, I think, a very interesting life. I wanted to begin today's proceedings by showing you a photograph, one of my favorite photographs of my mother. This is my mother at age 17. I believe this is her high school photograph. I'll reveal your age, Mom. This would have been just about 1941. And when I look at this photograph, and I look at my mother's smile, and I look at my mother's eyes, I see the hopes and the dreams of a young girl. A dream of meeting a man that would love her for all of her life. A dream of having children, of having a home, having grandchildren, friends and family. My mother's life story is the story of a young girl who lived the life of her dreams. I am so happy for her. I hope you're happy for her, and we should all be so lucky. My mother was born in New Waterford, Nova Scotia. She was the youngest of 13 children. Think of that, 13 children. New Waterford, Nova Scotia was a tiny little fishing village. She was of French-Canadian descent. In Nova Scotia, the French-Canadians were minorities. They had the poorest of the jobs. Her family were largely fishermen, many of whom perished at sea. And at the age of 2, they immigrated to the United States. But as my cousin Mary Tobin pointed out to me last week, my mother's mother had 13 children from 1904 to 1924, 13 children in a 20-year period. When my mother was born, her older sister, Elvina Rouland, a very nice French name, Elvina Rouland already had a child, George. So my mother was born an aunt to a nephew who was older than her. Anyway, they came to the United States and they moved to Watertown, where I think many of you know. She attended a school where she spoke French half the day and English half the day until 8th grade. She was very proud of her French heritage. And it's something that has kept with our family. My mother is known to most of us as Nana or Mom, but within her family, she was Baby Alice. Isn't that funny, Baby Alice? And I remember so often when we were younger, she had a very close family, lots of sisters, and they would come over to the house, and the bond, the affection of that family was so obvious. This was not a family that fought and argued. This was the complete opposite. They'd all come over. They all loved Baby Alice. And I wanted to make a mention of some of her sisters because they were so important. Her sister Irene, her sister Frances Beaupre, Mary Mouzette, 2 more very nice French names. Her sister, her sister Josephine. And I also want to mention particularly my Uncle Peter. Mary, his daughter Mary and his son Ricky are here. And I mention it because, number one, your father was an exceptional person. We loved him. We admired him so much. But he and my mother were very, very close. And when you would see them together, you would see the protective older brother and the adoring little sister. And it was really a wonderful relationship. I'm so glad to have experienced it. I'm so glad that you would come here today. And most importantly, my Aunt Ann, who was my mother's closest friend for 88 years. What can I say? Aunt Ann, she was a wonderful person. And my mother was so fortunate to have that family. I think that it is clear that my mother's desire and her dreams of her own family sprang from the family into which she was born. And when my mother got married, she wasted no time taking on that role, because she was a 24-year-old bride. She moved into the home with my grandfather, my Uncle Archie, my father, and she immediately became the woman, the matriarch of that family. Think of that, 24 years old, right into the pit, so to speak, right into the fire. But it was a role that, and I'm not minimizing the amount of work, but it was a role that she thrived in. And she was just, that kind of person. Now, my grandfather recognized that in her. She was the daughter that he had always wanted. My grandmother had died when my father was only 7 years old, so there hadn't been a woman in that household for 20 years. And she stepped into that role, and my grandfather adored her, and she adored my grandfather. And I could see that, and that was such an important relationship. No father-in-law loved his daughter-in-law more than my grandfather loved my mother. And in return, no daughter-in-law loved her father-in-law more than my mother loved my grandfather. And so my grandfather understood. My grandfather came here to the United States at the age of 17, alone from Poland. And he understood that my mother would serve as the rock, the foundation upon which his entire progeny would be based. So although there is no question that none of us in our family would be here today if it were not for my grandfather, it is equally true that none of us would be here, none of us would have what we have, the family that we have, none of us would have the success and the pleasures and the joys in life that we have if it were not for my mother. And that is a debt of gratitude that will forever exist. I think also that during their lives, I think that my mother and that my grandfather took comfort in the knowledge that their final resting place would be here in this spot, lying near to each other. And I find that to be of comfort to me, and I think hopefully to the rest of you as well. My mother was a homemaker of extraordinary talent and energy. The simple, I shouldn't say simple, the role of wife and mother in and of itself is overwhelming, as we all know. She was that 24/7, and as I said earlier, she thrived. I'm not saying it was easy for her, but she stepped up to it. She thrived in that atmosphere. But she was so much more. She was she was an excellent cook in her day. I can remember her cooking full meals, elaborate meals for the 8 of us. Served everything on time, ham, turkey, chickens, all the sides, everything, gravy, dessert, making it look easy. We took it for granted, we really did. It's just extraordinary. She was a very accomplished seamstress. She could sew. She spent hours and hours sewing many, many things. Where she found the time, I really don't know. She was a very talented interior decorator. She was a crackerjack secretary in her younger days, and she knew English and grammar better than any of us in the home. When we were in high school, she typed our papers. She could type 60 words a minute, correct all our grammar, and until really just a few months before her death, her ability to spell was astounding. I mean, National Spelling Bee champion ability to spell. You would ask her to spell, this was a recent example. She was asked to spell encyclopedia a couple months ago. didn't miss a beat. I don't think I can spell encyclopedia. But she had that kind of brain and that ability to do all these things. Really remarkable. She was everybody's nurse, up until the age of 88. And she was also a very talented pianist, and she retained the ability to play the piano really until just a few months before the end of her life. But I think that her favorite role, I really do, in life was role of grandmother. I think that she felt that grandmother was the reward that she received for being a devoted wife and such a dedicated mother, because she reveled in her grandchildren. You know, my mother did not and could not find fault in her children, and most especially in her grandchildren. And it wasn't that she was a fool. She knew our faults. She knew our limitations and our shortcomings, but she chose not to emphasize those. She knew that in the world that we live in, you're constantly reminded of your shortcomings and your faults. There's no lack of that. Her role was to remind us and to reinforce us in our strengths and in our virtue. And I think as parents, I think there's a very, very important lesson in making that choice. But because her role of grandmother was so important to her, I have asked Pamela Rutecki, her granddaughter, to come and to tell us about a book of memories that Pamela has prepared. And this is the book right here. There are several copies. We will try to arrange to have some more. So Pamela, please come up here and share your book of memories with us.
So I'm just gonna briefly give a summary of what hopefully you guys will all be able to read in this book. I'm just gonna put this right here. Uncle already mentioned this, but so besides Grandpa, who I always heard call her Mama, everybody called her Nana. Even my parents called her Nana. Whether they were blood relatives or not, my friends, it felt like neighbors. I mean, everybody called her Nana. That's because she was what a Nana is to everyone. She took care of people. She treated people like they were special, or at least as if they were part of our family. But her grandchildren, I think that Nana she was born to be a Nana. While it isn't hard to remember the couple years of her illness towards the end of her life, what we've put in this book is almost 4 decades of memories that she gave us. The grandchildren got together, wrote this book. Just a few of the things that we'll cherish about Nana. So Rachel talks about her hospitality, the sleepovers that she would have, and her lava hot food preparation. David talks about how it felt to be at Nana and Grandpa's house, and how she and Grandpa had a particular way of telling stories together. Holly talks about the sound advice she gave about marriage, one of Nana's favorite topics to discuss, as well as how her whisper was arguably louder than her normal speaking voice. Tara mentions how Nana was keenly interested in caring for her home, and even inspected other people's curtains. Johnny highlights Nana's famous musical ability and how she passed on that tradition to be developed by her grandchildren. Kathleen revisits how Nana always wanted to know about our lives, and even if she didn't understand them, she really championed our interests. Billy talks about the way that Nana would always compliment and praise us. She was our cheerleader. Andy recalls an instance where Nana asserts she has her own mind. She would always do that, but she still managed to be a peacemaker in the family. Nathan talked about Nana's thoughtfulness and her love of Jeopardy. So when you read the memories, or if you have a chance to talk to any of us grandchildren, you'll notice that a few themes pop up. That's because when you're little, the little things mean a lot. And so we hope you'll see the enduring legacy that Nana has left us as adults, so that in the future, even when you meet her for the first time, you'll want to call her Nana.
Thank you, Pam. My brother John would now like to share some remembrances of my mother with you.
Thank you, Pam, too. You said that so nicely. So I'm probably going to echo some of the comments that Rob and Pam just offered. My mom was sick for a long time. And so if you only got to know her in the last 10 years or so, you really didn't know the mom or Nana that we came to know over really many decades of her life that preceded her illness. So I want to work hard to remember her, not for what she was like when she was sick, but what she was like when she was parenting us. And I'll take you back a long way, kind of like what Rob did, to the very beginning of how our family began. It's a story that Dad told me really just in recent years. I didn't know this particular detail of it. He told us that he had a neighbor who was also a workmate at Westinghouse, who could tell that Dad was interested in beginning his family life and looking for a woman that he could share his life with. So this neighbor had another girlfriend in mind for my father. It could be a blind date. And Dad was receptive to it. But before he got to meet the blind date, he went to an office party. I think it may have been a Christmas party. And at the office party, all the secretaries from Westinghouse, which included Alice Sampson, were present. And who was the life of the party? Nana, okay? And everyone at the party was so impressed with Nana, particularly when she sat down at the piano. Because boy, could she play the piano. And then when she ripped off the raucous rendition of Boogie Woogie Rag, that was it. Dad was hooked, so to speak, right? She was the one for him. Well, he then told me that they began dating and they became engaged. Then one day, Mom was in Beth Israel Hospital for a few days. She was sick back in 2015. And I was driving Dad home, and we were crossing along where the Arnold Arboretum is. And he said to me something that I don't know if I can tell you without crying, but I'm going to do the best I can. He said that shortly before they got married, they went for a picnic lunch at the Arnold Arboretum. And there was my mother sitting across the blanket from him. And he looked at her and he told me, I thought I was looking at the most beautiful woman in the world. That moved me. And you know, he was right. My mother was a beautiful woman, you can see. But it wasn't her external beauty that touched us. It was her inner beauty. And you've heard Rob articulate it, and Pam mentioned it so beautifully. And it's hard to just communicate the qualities. But her inner beauty came in the form of her kindnesses and her mildness. You know, it's hard to remember a time when Mom got angry. I mean, really let it loose. Although I do remember one time. And it was all Robbie's fault. But, you know, and Robbie has said it so beautifully. I mean, she was outrageously supportive of her family. It didn't matter whether we were right or wrong. We were right in her eyes. But the quality that really comes across to me is the many ways that she was generous to us. You know, it's been described with her time and her praise, you know, all the things that she would do for us, and with money too. I have all these vivid memories of being a teenage boy and going out for the night, and Mom saying to me, well, do you have enough money? So I think about that for a minute. Let's see, do I have enough? Oh, maybe I could use a little bit more. And a $20 bill would appear, and you know, a $20 bill today, that's like $100 bill or $200. You know, it's a lot of money. And she was just always that like generous to us. That's the woman that we want to remember. Now, it's so interesting that the Bible says that God will hold her in his memory and bring her back to the paradise. We look forward to that time. Pam mentioned that. But if God's going to hold her in his memory, I want to hold her in my memory too. And in holding her in my memory, I want to learn from her. I want to apply in my life the things that she, and frankly my father too, the two are almost interchangeable. A bunch of years ago when Cheryl and I were living in Spokane, Washington, and David, where's David? Right here, was about 3.5 years old. Some friends came over to visit us, and they had a young son about David's age, and they went out to play in the front yard. Cheryl and I visited with the friends inside. The phone rang, and it was my neighbor across the street. The neighbor across the street said to me, "John, you better come outside and see what your son is doing out there." Well, I had planted a magnolia tree in the front yard. You know, it's a beautiful, sometimes they call it a tulip tree. I had planted it there. And so I went to the front door and I looked out, and there's David, 3.5-year-old David. Now, his children shouldn't really listen to this story because it's not a bad example for him. But he had a plastic baseball bat in his hand, and he had just smashed off 2 limbs from the magnolia tree. And he was saying to his friend, "Here, Ephraim, why don't you knock one off too?" And in that very moment, I'm telling you this is an absolute truth. You would think that I would have been furious with him for destroying this precious tree of mine. But really, I laughed. I laughed and I thought to myself, it was like an epiphany. I said, imagine all the things that my parents had to suffer through when the 4 of us were growing up together. And then a just whole litany of things that we had done to destroy the family property at 97, the Hanton Avenue. And then I thought to myself, what would Mom and Dad have done if they had caught me doing something like that? And my whole life it has influenced me that way. My wife Cheryl told me just the other day that whenever she was facing a parenting issue, that she would often think to herself, how would Nana handle it? So it's the memory of Nana and my father too, and how they cared for her so lovingly, that has to stay with us. And I urge you, if you knew Nana, remember that and apply it in your life. Try to do the things that she would do and how she would handle it. There's no better way to honor her memory or my father's memory than to learn by their fine example.
Thank you, Ross. You know, we've heard about what a wonderful caregiver my mother was, but in the later years, the last years of her life, she was unable to do that, and she deserved to be cared for in her last years with the same attention and love that she gave during really the first 88 years of her life. So I'd like to acknowledge some of those caregivers right now. The first is my father. My parents had a traditional marriage. My mother was my father's nurse for 65 years of marriage, and I am not exaggerating. He had a lot of health issues, and she was right there all the time. And when my mother became sick, in a stunning reversal of roles, my father became her nurse. I have such admiration and respect that at his age, he was able to do that. That vow that he made to honor and respect and love in sickness and in health, boy, did he give that meaning, real meaning. And so, Dad, we couldn't go past today without acknowledging what you did for Mom and setting that example for the rest of us. It was really, really special. The second person I'd like to mention is my wife, Sue. When my mother first became sick in June of 2015, she had a stroke things changed dramatically overnight. Susie came down, she quit her job, she gave up her home. She and I lived for 15 months with my parents, and those were tough times. My mother went through a lot of changes. A lot of things were happening that we didn't expect, we didn't know how to deal with. They were very difficult times, and Susie was there 24/7 throughout the whole process. And Sue, I am forever grateful and forever indebted for what you did for my mother during that period of time. I also would like to mention Moya Keneally sitting right over here. For the last year, Moya has been my mother's primary caretaker, my mother's best friend. She has provided care of a level and of a detail that's really just unsurpassed. People talk about going the extra mile. Moya Keneally went the extra 100 miles. She really did. Moya, I really don't know, I mean it, how could we ever have gotten through this last year without you, really? So thank you so much. Diane Baralik, who was a hospice nurse, who not only brought expertise that we didn't have and trained us in hospice care, true hospice care, but she showed us what hospice meant. She showed us what it meant to allow somebody to live in sickness with dignity and respect. And thank you, Diane, so much for that. Sherry Ritchie, who only came for one morning a week, but I'm so impressed with a whirlwind of activity and how much she could accomplish in just one morning and how that would last during the week. I'd also want to mention Betty Standing, Gaynell Clark, Amanda Couto, Vanessa Granrus, and Adriana, whose last name escapes me, all of whom, were really critical in helping us take care of my mother. I'd like to offer these final thoughts. My mother laughed easily, she laughed frequently, she laughed infectiously. She created a home environment for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren that was welcoming, nurturing, open, friendly, safe and relaxing, free, completely free of stress, conflict, recriminations. It was really a wonderful, wonderful home that she created. But most of all, my mother's life was about service and sacrifice to others, to her family, to her friends. That was how my mother demonstrated love in her acts, in what she did. My mother never asked for anything in return. I mean that. My mother never expected anything in return. And my mother never even wanted anything in return. It was the act of giving, the act of sacrifice that gave meaning to my mother's life. So I feel quite sure that I speak for us all when I say that my mother's life of love, devotion, service, and sacrifice shall endure forever in our hearts, hearts of her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, friends, and family. And that we shall carry that love for her and love her for the rest of our lives as truly and as deeply as she loved us. So with that, I would like to call on Dan Haig to give us a final concluding prayer.
Our great and caring Father, Jehovah, each of us come before you at this very somber occasion, but also very encouraging occasion, thinking about the life of Alice Rattecki, Nana. And we know that her example of love, devotion, kindness, generosity, caring, compassion, all of these qualities have affected each and every one of our lives. Whether we're a friend, a son, a daughter, a grandchild, a great-grandchild. And so we thank you for the privilege of knowing her and being next to her in many occasions. And we ask that your spirit be upon the family and close friends. Help them to have peace of mind, peace of heart, and to reminisce about the great times, the great example that she set in her life. We also pray that you have promised that she has been written down in a book of life. And we look forward to the time when under your kingdom, which we pray for in the Lord's Prayer, that your will would be done on earth. And part of that will is that she would be resurrected to a beautiful, beautiful home in beautiful health. And so we thank you for that hope. We thank you for your son who died on behalf of us all. And may your spirit and guidance and protection be upon all of us as the day goes on today. And we ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, thank you, everyone. That concludes our burial service. There is going to be a memorial service at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Sharon this afternoon. I believe the address is 374 Old Post Road in Sharon. Obviously, all are welcome. Jed, are we going to have a